This book, which you see on the screen, okay, I bought before I met Alex, before he was here and started his speaking tour. And I was working here one day because the kids over there threw me out that we were teaching in Baker's factory, so I was over here working. And one of the guys, I won't mention his name because he isn't here tonight, but I told him I was going to embarrass him anyway. He came up and said, hey, can I borrow this book for a minute and look through it? Sure. Then I was about ready to leave at night, and he came over and he says, can I keep this until tomorrow morning? Well, that was like 3 weeks ago, and I just got this back yesterday, okay? Now, I have a name for people like that because I have a large book collection, and I call them bookkeepers. They don't understand that when I first call them a bookkeeper, but they do after a while because I get irritated. But this book did cost me money. I did buy it. Alex was quite grateful for distributing some of these books at our last meeting as well. But it was really worthwhile, the purchase price. And Alex is a gentleman that, in my opinion, deserves much more credit, not only for the book, but for the life he's lived, okay, which is more entrepreneurial than mine by far. And I'm a lot older than he is, and I've done 4 or 5 companies of my own, but his success and his distress, okay, really speaks to what an entrepreneurial person is. And I won't say any more about that. Alex, you are back there somewhere? Oh, there he is. Okay, come on up. Alex Cohen.
Thanks, Dave. I've never had one of these traditional microphones before. Kind of loungy. Is it good volume? Can you hear me? Okay, my name's Alex Cowen. I run a company called Leonid Systems, which builds enterprise software for communications companies, companies like France Telecom and Verizon. And I'm also the author of a book called Starting a Tech Business, as Dave mentioned. And starting a tech business is about taking your ideas and making them a reality. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about you guys for a second. What we're going to talk about together today is there's a lot of new ideas about how to start companies and build products. And there's a lot of excitement about those ideas. And there's a lot of great success stories. You hear one, it seems like every week. But then in actual practice, very few people are actually doing a lot of these things that are making these companies successful. So my goal, my area of interest with the book and the activities that I do around the book is addressing the big void between all these new ideas about how to start companies and build products and actual practice. So let's talk about you guys for a second. I'm assuming a few things. Hopefully they're true and you guys don't get bored. First, I'm assuming that you have the desire to learn about launching new ideas. Second, I'm not assuming that you have any prior knowledge about software development or engineering in general. And lastly, I'm assuming you want to take action, that you want to walk out of here with something, some ideas that you can go into your office tomorrow and immediately apply to make new products, new ideas, and new companies. So there are 4 ideas that we're going to talk about in these areas: ideation, planning, organization, and development. So ideation, for our purpose here, is the process of taking your ideas and organizing them into an actionable set of steps and a coherent concept for something that people are really going to want to use. So before, we're going to kind of compare the old way and the new way. Before, you had what I would call a lot of self-love. Your idea was your baby, and you stuck with it to the end, bitter, sweet, or otherwise. And now we have this idea of design thinking, which instead emphasizes careful observation of your target users, your target customers, empathy, and applying directed creativity to the empathy that you acquire through that process. So in some ways, this idea of self-love and sticking with your idea to the end is a very classical idea. Henry Ford said, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. And there's a certain validity to this. I mean, if you're really, really breaking new ground, sometimes you do need to just stick to your guns, be confident, have faith, and persevere through it. But look at Ford now. And they kind of never changed. You know, they're not doing as well. So once you have product in the market, I think it's reasonable to say this idea of design thinking is universally applicable, and it's universally a success factor that determines which companies do well and don't do well. I would say there's two pillars to design thinking. The first one is empathy. This woman's a seamstress. She's sewing, but seamstresses spend a lot of time cutting, and they require very, very, very close, dexterous cutting. And so somebody who had a lot of empathy, understanding of the seamstress, created sewing scissors. Have you ever had a pair of sewing scissors compared to regular scissors? Yeah. I mean, they're incredible. Your hand slides right into them. You can sit there and cut for hours and hours. It's not something I do regularly, but I mean, as a child, I like to cut things out of construction paper, make stuff. So there's some very specific tools that we use in the high-tech industry to apply this idea of design thinking. And they're quite useful, and they're very easy to pick up and start using, which is one of the reasons why they're on my list to address here today. So the first one is personas. The persona is not, we're going to talk about them in a second, persona is not just a set of statistics. A persona is a vivid description of your user, your customer, so that basically you know them like you know your best friend. Oops, sorry. So this is an example of a bad persona. This photo, it looks like it came off the internet or some stock art. The notes here are basic demographic, statistical things. This is something any of you could probably sit down at the internet and put this together in 20 minutes or less. These statistics here look like they came off of a questionnaire, and that's really not what personas is about. We can't expect users, buyers of our product to go out and tell us whether our idea is right or not. So the key thing in developing personas is careful observation, not expecting the user to tell you whether you're on the right track or not, but really wanting to understand them in a lot of detail around anything that has to do with how they are going to find out about, learn about, decide to buy, decide to use, decide to renew or reuse your product. And one thing, I mentioned these look like they came off a questionnaire. Well, you know, and I have a few teams that I mentor, and I see a lot of this. The questionnaire is an okay tool to use to go talk to customers, but it's only okay for very, very, very tactical things, like do you buy potatoes or not? You can't ask a customer, hey, would you be interested in a product like this, especially if it's novel, because they'll tell you yes or no, but it's almost meaningless. And there's a great story about that. Way back when they had Walkman still, Sony organized a focus group, and they had a yellow Walkman that they were thinking of rolling out. So they had a focus group, a bunch of people that came in, and they said, hey, what do you think about this yellow Walkman? You like it? And everybody said, you know, and this is what tends to happen in focus groups, everybody starts saying the same thing based on whoever talks the most and talks less. They said, yeah, I love this yellow Walkman, it makes me feel sporty, and it's so interesting, and it's so much better than the black Walkmans that we used to have, and they all said how great this yellow Walkman was. And then somebody who organized that focus group had the foresight to put two piles of Walkmans on two tables as everyone walked out. A pile of yellow Walkmans and a pile of black Walkmans. Does anybody know this story? Everybody took the black Walkman on the way out. Strange, right? They all said they loved the yellow Walkman. They all said how great it was. And I think the key point here is when you're developing personas, don't go for the jugular. You know, your job is to understand this person, and you shouldn't expect them to tell you whether your product is right or not. You're going to have to come to that conclusion based on your understanding of this person. This is a little bit better persona. This photo is lo-fi, it was taken with my iPhone, and you can see this is a narrative. It's more like a description of this person as if they were in a play or a book or something like that. We know this person. We feel like, you know, we've met them, we've spent time with them, and that's what a really good persona looks like. The next thing we have, the next tool is, once we have these personas, we develop user stories about what these personas want to do with our product. And these stories have three very specific components, and we'll talk a little bit later about why those are particularly important, but they are, whoever this persona is, I want to do something or other so that I can derive a benefit, why they want to do this. And one thing that's interesting, and I see a lot of when I'm working with teams and my own staff at Leonid, in teaching them how to develop stories is that they tend to leave out this last item, the motivation. And that's the worst thing you can do, especially when you're a startup and you're learning about your users and you're creating ideas about why they want to do things, because the most important thing is to establish a criteria that you can validate or invalidate about why they want to do what they want to do. So everybody gets, hey, you need to say what the persona is, you need to say what they want to do. It's extremely important that you include this last part of the story so that you're establishing why you think the person really wants to do this. Because that's what you're going to have to find out whether you write about or not. So most important, this is a photo taken of some work by the mysterious and wonderful street artist Banksy. And I think the most important thing about design thinking is actually wanting to do it, actually caring about the user. That's the most important thing. There are designers, and of course they practice design thinking, and they have a natural ability that they've supplemented with an education, and that makes them, that makes them designers. They could make a pair of sewing scissors, they can build something, but anybody can be the person that goes in and has that skill to go and diagnose the user and write those stories about them. And I recommend that everybody do that if you're working on a new idea with a new company or an existing company. So the next area we have after ideation is planning. So before, we had this 5-year plan, which is a great thing to have. I think that the communists actually invented the 5-year plan. Russia had a 5-year plan. China had a 5-year plan. It's not a very good fit for startups because you don't really know what's going to happen. And now you have this idea of iterative management, which is basically applying the scientific method in very short cycle experiments to your startup so that you have a very definite criteria for a go or no go or pivot or persevere as it's put in the very popular book, Lean Startup. And the great thing about this idea of iterative management is that, the 5-year plan was never a good tool for startups. I mean, I spent lots of time trying to, prepare for board meetings where I could explain how what we're doing bizarrely, somehow coheres to this original 5-year plan. But, the alternative of being a tree in the wind and having no plan at all is equally unmanageable and equally destructive. So the great thing about all this is that there was a wonderful standby all along, a substitute for these two things, and it's science, plain old science that we all learned in school. So in science, in the scientific method, you have an idea. You create a hypothesis, which is just a set of assumptions about that idea that are provable or disprovable. And then you design a series of experiments to either prove or disprove those assumptions. You execute those experiments, and that's what you're focused on as a startup, is validating whether you're right about the fundamental proposition of the business. And then the idea is, after these experiments, you come to a conclusion, your idea is proved or disproved. If it's disproved, you miss some things, you revise and you go through it again. And if it's proved, you go out and you scale up the business, you expand, you can go tell people that you know what you're doing. So there's some very specific lightweight tools that are very well suited to this. The first one is just a simple table with a set of these assumptions. So the most important thing is that you prioritize these assumptions. You want to pick the assumptions that are most important and easiest to prove, and you want to put those at the top because they're going to be easy to prove, cheap, fast, and they're going to tell you a lot about whether your idea is got legs or not. So then you have the assumption itself and whether it needs proving. Now, it's important to lay out all your assumptions, whether they need to be proven or not. Just because an idea is important doesn't mean it needs to be proven. I'll show you guys a couple examples. In the last column, of course, we have the experiment we're going to use to prove or disprove the idea, and we'll go through a couple examples of that. So parents want, let's say, an app to better organize the distribution of their kids' allowances. Well, that needs to be proven. It's not necessary. Who knows? Do they really want that? I don't know. So a couple things you can do that are very popular in general for this kind of thing are, you can post ads online using Google AdWords. You can spend $100 or less and just see what rates of click-through you get when you put those ideas up. You can vary the proposition and the wording of these things, and that'll tell you a lot about whether there's innate interest in that particular proposition. When they click through to a landing page or website of some sort, it doesn't have to be fancy, it can be very, very simple. You can see what they go and click on, which landing pages are most effective, what the users will go through and look at. That's a very typical example of of how we use this to go out and on a very quick and easy basis, you can do this in a weekend, prove or disprove to a certain degree whether there's innate interest in this idea. The next one here, parents have smartphones that they could use to run this application. Well, that doesn't need to be proven. I mean, there's data out there, people intuitively just know that parents have smartphones. The next thing we're going to go over is this idea of a business model canvas. So if the 5-year plan, which is usually coupled with an elaborate business plan, is not the right tool in today's world for startups, then what is? Well, Alex Osterwalder, who's actually another Wiley author, rolled out a book called The Business Model Canvas. Actually, I don't think that's what it's called. What did he call it? Business Model Generation. And he introduced this idea of the business model canvas. And this has 9 key areas. And the great thing about this is that it's kind of in between a big elaborate traditional business plan and sketching out your idea on a napkin and a piece of paper. It has some specific structure, and it's almost kind of a checklist to make sure that you've thought through all the key ideas about the business. And you can go online. There's actually some links to this on alexandercowan.com, my website. And I highly recommend downloading the PDF version of this, sitting there and just filling it out. I think it'll probably help you a lot in your team. And the last item we have is a financial model. And a lot of people, depending on their background, find this to be one of the most challenging parts. And there's a couple things that are really important. The biggest mistake I see when people are putting together these financial models is that they try to pull more significant digits out of what they know about the business than actually exists. So if somebody asked you, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? You'd probably know it's going to be, what do you think it'll be downtown? 65, 68 degrees. And you know, you can look at the almanac and historical weather reports and you can make a pretty good guess about that. But if they asked you, well, can you figure out what the weather is going to be like out to 3 significant digits, like it's going to be 68.003 degrees, well, there's really no way you can do that. No matter how much research you did or planning or analysis, you're really not going to get much of a better number. So the important thing with your financial model, and there's a template on alexandercowan.com, is that in the very short term, you take a very, very detailed look at your costs, because what you don't want to do is run out of money. And having a nice, tight model about your expenses in the short term will, paradoxically or not, keep you from having to worry about money every day. And then you want to have a setup in your model where you can just sort of extrapolate out on a unit basis how big the business could be without a lot of elaborate financial modeling, because again, you know, that's just wasted time. So some notes and examples of how to do this on my website, and those are some general principles that I think will help you. So the 3 tools that we have for planning are the list of assumptions, the business model canvas, and a good, solid financial model. The last thing we've got on planning is let's step through how this idea of the scientific method applies to the formulation of a startup. So the idea, we talked about that being the very first step. Do I have real evidence from my buyer that this is compelling? And the best way you're going to get that is working from users and buyers that you know well. And the second one, the hypothesis, is what are the key assumptions required to make this business work, and which ones are the most important? And that's the next thing you're asking yourself as you're creating that list of assumptions. Then, how do I definitively prove or disprove the most important assumptions with a minimum of time and effort? That's the next thing you want to do. Then you execute your experiments. These are extremely helpful in a startup because they help keep you focused. And what you want to ask yourself as you're doing that is, am I focused on proving out my business model, or am I just responding to whatever's sort of coming up on a day-to-day basis? And then finally, the great thing is that this gives you a true or untrue conclusion about all this, and you can either revise, go back, test this stuff before you've scaled up too much, or say, look, you know, looks like we got something here, we're going to scale it up. So the third item we have is organization. Before, we had what I would call aping. The idea was a startup will become a big company by having the staff and the organizational structures and just generally acting like a large company. It sounds ridiculous and it sounds crazy, but this was actually very prevalent, especially during the dot-com period, and in a lot of ways it still is. And the substitute we have for this is this idea of customer development, which was first introduced in a book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank. And the idea is that A small organization, a startup, which hasn't yet ascertained a product market fit, its fit of its product into its market, is fundamentally different than a large company, which is working on scaling and efficiency. Now, one common misperception I run into is that this means that big companies run with processes and org charts are bad, and that's absolutely untrue. There are plenty of startups that have faltered because as they grew, they failed to create those processes and that infrastructure and mature and become efficient. And in fact, at Leonid, we actually run both of these models in parallel. So for our mature products, we have a relatively traditional model. Development builds them, sales sells them, operations supports them. And when we develop new products, we have this idea of a customer development team. And the customer development team is a little different than the traditional organization in that it's not optimized for maximum efficiency and scale and predictability and reproducibility. It's designed around a relatively small, homogeneous, fluid team that is able to work together, developers, consultants, people that are touching the customer, together to ascertain what product should we be building here, what does this customer really want, and reacting to those things very quickly and moving through that iterative loop that we just talked about as quickly as possible. And that's fundamentally something that a large organization that's built to scale isn't as good for. And that's really the thing that customer development has brought us in high tech, is this idea that there is an alternative way to organize your teams before you have a product market fit. And that's when you kind of hit this inflection point and you want to build a more scalable, mission, process-driven organization. So let's take a look at how all this stuff actually works when we do these things the old way versus the new way. So in the old way, our founders get a great idea. They create a 5-year plan. It's going to excite VCs. It shows a 10x return, because that's what a traditional VC wants to see if they're going to put money into a startup. The problem is this creates a chain of assumptions that's so tenuous that your odds of winning the lottery are better than actually reproducing this 5-year plan, even if you are in fact successful. So let's say our startup gets this funding. They're in a hot space, the VCs like it. They're in a scale business themselves, so they want to put a lot of capital to work. And that's a problem because this encourages a startup to do this aping thing that we talked about before and hire a lot of people, go to the lawyers and accountants and consultants that big companies use and just generally spend a lot of money. And the big problem with that isn't just spending a lot of money, it's that big company experience is not the same thing as small company experience. Big company managers and executives that are used to delegating and organizing and scaling a business don't necessarily have that skill set you need in a startup to really get your hands dirty, be very observational, have your hands in every little detail to figure out what's going on. And that's a big problem. These new hires come in from big companies with established track records, doing what they do, and it just doesn't work. The salesperson is ill-suited to this startup because they're used to selling big deals, and that's what the VCs want to have happen. But they're used to selling big deals against known propositions to known customers, not unknown propositions to customers that the startup isn't sure yet who exactly that they are. So the new hires put these recipes to work, they lack this hands-on experience, everybody's trying to explain how they're somehow conforming to this 5-year plan, and it's tough. I've done it a couple times. Late nights, trying to make something up for the board that somehow makes sense with this 5-year plan. It's almost impossible to do in a credible way. So they face the board, and it's very hard to explain the progress against the 5-year plan, and you can kind of see where this goes. So let's take a look at how this looks when we apply these new ideas. The founders get a great new idea. So they lay out all their key assumptions. And this idea of laying out the assumptions and quickly proving or disproving them in the way that we talked about earlier, that's going to A, lower the amount of capital that they need to raise, and B, it's going to reduce the amount of risk in the business because they've already gone out and validated a lot of the things that a potential investor, and it's good to always think of yourself, like what if I was going to put my money into this? The things that investor is going to find questionable at the business, the risk factors that they're going to perceive. And this may also lower their amount of capital that they want, because what they want is not to build a big company. They know that this isn't the time to do that. They're just trying to validate that they have a fundamental product market fit. So This is good because it opens up non-traditional funding avenues for them. Friends and family, bootstrapping the business. At Leonid, we're a multi-million-dollar global software company. I mean, we're not Microsoft, but we've never taken a dollar venture capital. And I would say that was almost impossible to do 5 or 10 years ago just because it cost so much money to build a product and it was so difficult. But now it's a lot easier and it really is possible to build a large business without taking any or any substantial amount of investment. At Leonid, for example, we did a lot of consulting in the early days, which was billable and it was a more predictable revenue stream, and that allowed us to fund the business and build up our software module base. So back to our story here. The founders are free to bring in advisors and resources as they need, but they're not pulling in people too early because they're doing things in a stepwise fashion. They're proving out their idea before they go off and start building stuff and trying to scale the big company, hiring salespeople and marketing people. And this gives them clear and immediate priorities on hiring. The new hires are focused on this idea of customer development, on proving out these assumptions. And that's really important because in a startup, you have this very difficult pairing of urgency and uncertainty. And that can make management very difficult. But the list of assumptions that we looked at earlier is a great management tool. It's very visible to everybody. Everyone can understand it and operate around it. So we're going out, we're validating these assumptions. The team is running full tilt at a moment where they ascertain whether they have a product market fit or not, and whether they scale up the business, or whether they say, we need to revise our idea and loop through this again as quickly as possible to get to a result that tells us we ought to scale. The progress is quick and the progress is measurable. People know what they're doing, which again helps with managing through the environment you have in a startup. When it's time to face the music with the board, which may just be the founders themselves, they have a set of data to look at that tell them, were we right or were we wrong? Should we revise or should we scale up and make this business bigger? And everyone gets to decide what it's working on. The worst thing that happens in this situation is that you learn a lot that you can apply to your next venture. And that's really one of the greatest things about using this methodology. So the last item we have is development. How do we actually create product? In the old days, we had this idea of waterfall development. It was a very sequential system created around building big products over relatively long time scales. So you create a set of requirements, and then you built the design, and then you did the implementation. And what this is, it's like creating a piece of legislation at the beginning. Your product people, your marketing people, they're trying to make a list of requirements. And the problem with this, the reason that it's fundamentally ill-suited to a startup is that you really just don't know exactly, no matter how good you are, no matter how fantastic a job you've done of learning about this market, you're never going to know everything about what the product ought to be. And Agile, which you probably heard of, is a alternate method that's actually kind of in a way a return to some of the early days of the way software is developed, and it's great for a couple reasons. One is it takes the personas and the user stories that we talked about earlier under design thinking as its primary input. So we're not trying to build a list of requirements or a detailed design. We're taking these very empathic inputs about our user base, and that is our starting point for doing work with our developers. Everybody here can develop a persona, everyone can write a user story, and if you care enough about your user base, you probably do a really fantastic job. So what that means is that everybody can build a great software product. It doesn't take any specialized knowledge. You just have to be interested in an area, have an idea that's interesting, that's relevant to you, and you can start working with a team and developing product. The stories you discuss with your development team, they execute the development, and you're doing this in very small loops that kind of mirror the iterative loop that we looked at when we talked about iterative management. So these are generally in 2 to 6 week cycles, where each time you're delivering a working product that you can sit down and look at and show to users and how people react to and decide what you're going to do next. And if you've heard about Agile, you may have heard, you may have seen big, long books or heard lectures from your friends that do this, but the interesting thing about Agile is this. The original Agile manifesto was published in 2001, and it was only 68 words. And essentially all it said was, we value individual interactions over processes and tools. We value working software over comprehensive documentation, specs, requirements documents. we value collaboration over contracts, and we value responding to change over following a plan, an arbitrary plan. It was literally that simple. So this is what Agile is about. Now, Agile spawned lots of methodologies that are, some of them are quite complex, and those are appropriate in some places. But the important thing to remember is you can go online and read the Agile Manifesto in about less than 5 minutes and understand a lot about what it says about how to develop software. When you're using Agile, your life as the product owner, the person that understands what the product's supposed to be, is kind of like this. In the past iteration, the one that you just finished, you're going out and your job is to validate the feature relevance with customers. And one of the great things about design thinking and those stories and those personas that we developed is that it actually gives you something to think about what you're seeing when you show customers the product. Was this persona accurate? Was this story on target? For the present iteration, you're collaborating with your team on building the product. You're answering their questions, you're discussing the stories that you created with them. And for the future iteration, you're going out and kind of based on what you're learning, you're making a backlog, a list of all the stories, all the ideas that you want to talk to the development team about for the next iteration. So this is kind of what life is really like when you're using this Agile methodology. So in summary, this design thinking gives us direction, personas, and user stories that we feed into this idea of iterative management. The iterative management, we create a hypothesis and an experimental design that allows us to go out and figure out whether we have a product that has a market or not. Customer development gives us a set of ideas about how to organize our team, so that we're not trying to ape a big company. We have an organization and a mission that's very appropriate to what we're trying to do. And Agile gives us a way to see working product very frequently in very tight loops, so that we know whether we're barking up the right tree or not. Online, on alexandercowan.com, I usually, when I do longer talks, I have another talk about how to actually apply this stuff called It Works When You Do It, and then some exercises. All that stuff's up on the website if you're interested, alexandercowan.com. And I'm at CowanSF on Twitter. Thanks a lot. Nice to meet you. And yeah, clap. Go ahead. Do you have any questions? Or?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Well, when I am starting up something, I'm always asked, even just by the bank or any investors, not even venture capitalists, I'm always asked for the detailed 5-year or sometimes 20-year plans.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to do it.
You absolutely have to do it.
But I don't want to lie or anything. I mean,
You're going to be lying. There's no way to avoid it.
Well, the thing is, it is a lie.
It is a lie. The VCs call it the big lie. The key thing is you're going to have to do it. I've done it. I still do it. The key thing is that, remember we talked about the temperature? You're going to have to tell them what the temperature is tomorrow. And you're going to have to tell them what it is to 3 significant digits. And you're both going to have to know how silly that is. The key thing is, don't spend a lot of time on the middle part of the financial model, on trying to create a lot of accuracy when you really don't have the inputs. If your business is new, I would do, focus on the short term, your expenses, so you don't have to worry about running out of money while you're figuring out where your revenue is going to come from and when. And then set up your model so that it's easy to kind of make it produce the numbers. You're not putting a lot of work into it. There's a template on my website. I built it because I had trouble finding a model that was like that. I mean, most of them are like, put in all these silly details that you don't really know. And I built this thing so that you can be very detail-oriented in the short term and very parametric, in the long term, where you're just producing a kind of a educated guess. It's appropriate to the data you have at the time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no,
okay. Other questions? Yes.
Okay, so I'm a software engineer, and when I hear Agile, the thing that scares me is it sounds like it's a Winchester Mystery House that you're going to just putting, do you ever get oh my God, the architecture's wrong?
Yeah, all the time. Let's see. So there's a couple things about Agile. I think, number one is, I think, when people talk about things with Agile, a lot of time they're talking about Scrum or XP or one of the specific methodologies, and they get kind of caught up in that stuff, like it's right for some reason. And one of the most important things about you newcomers, and you're obviously not a newcomer, is to read the Agile Manifesto, understand what it's about at the foundation level, because I think that will help everybody. As far as, if we do things in these short cycles, are we thinking about the architecture properly? I think there's a couple of general things that I think might be worth sharing in this forum. One is, there is this idea of an architecture spike, so there is this idea that you do an iteration where one or more of the people are just working on a design document. It doesn't say, don't do design if you think you should. That's one thing I think is important. It's not always the right idea to rush off and start making product. And then the second thing is, when this idea of getting to market quickly, validating your idea early, and seeing if you're right or not, there is a downside, which is that you may have to go back and revise the product a bunch. We have a big annual trade show, Lean in October. And our guys are working on 4 new product extensions. And they keep telling me, Alex, we're going to get this done in time, but we may have to go back and, change the architecture. We find it's not scalable, it's not secure enough. And, you just have to you have to accept that. And I think as a developer, communicating that to your management is always challenging, but I, know that it's a reality. I mean, it does happen when you bring stuff to market quickly, and there is sometimes a price to getting to market quickly. Yes?
I'm a project manager, and I was intrigued when you started to describe the customer development team, and I'd be curious if you'd expound upon that, but I'm also, that's one question. The other is customer development team something, that phrase, that name, something you developed and your company knows what it means? Or do other companies use that same phrase?
It was first introduced by a guy named Steve Blank in a book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which was a seminal book. It was the first high-tech book with a penis on the cover. It was also the first book that introduced this idea of customer development. And the biggest revelation, there's a lot of details.
So that means it's his phrase. It comes from
essentially, yeah. Mm-hmm. It's not like trademarked or anything. His book's really long. I would buy my book shorter.
Do you have your book for sale here? Because
yes.
I would like to buy it.
Yes, this woman here can sell it. But so it's his idea. I would say that the biggest idea, it's got a lot of details, and there's detailed facets to it. The biggest revelation about it is that a startup, a team where you're ascertaining a product market fit, where you're learning about what you should build, should be run differently than a team that's scaling and trying to reproduce and scale up a thing that's well understood. If there's a big idea, I think that was really the big idea. And all the details kind of fall out of that.
One more question.
Can you say a few words about how this would differentiate from a hardware development?
The same principles apply, I think. I mean, the issue with hardware is that if you're actually developing hardware, physical things, because so much of hardware products are actually firmware and sort of software development on top of prefab platforms. I just think that agile is the thing that's the most different, and then there's more design and planning up front. I was in the hardware business for a year. I ran away screaming after about 6 years, and I'm in software now. But I just think that the loops are necessarily longer. The interesting thing about hardware, and Dave's company, Maker's Factory, is a good example of this. Is that it's getting easier, it's getting more like the software business. The ideas are more fungible. But I think pure hardware, if you're actually fabbing stuff, the main difference is just that the loops are longer and the upfront design is a little bit more important. And more of a waterfall thing or more loops on planning may be appropriate.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.